Someone once tried to define genius. They said that a genius has two brains. One is normal, which may not be any smarter than anyone else's. The other is strange, which they cannot control. And that makes you think. Have you ever felt for a moment something different light up inside you? As if you suddenly saw the world from an angle that no one else can perceive. As if invisible connections became obvious. As if in the middle of an ordinary conversation, you were thinking on another frequency. But is that what genius really means? And if so, why is this difference almost always accompanied by a feeling of not belonging? She is in a meeting. The presentation is over. Everyone agrees. The proposal is solid. The schedule makes sense. The goals are clear. She looks around. She sees heads nodding in approval. She hears murmurs of validation. And then she realizes it. A central flaw, not a detail, not a misplaced comma, something structural, something that invalidates the entire premise of the project. She opens her mouth. She hesitates. She looks again at the faces around the table. No one saw it. And she knows that if she says anything, she will need to spend 15 minutes explaining what to her is obvious in 15 seconds. She will need to draw out the reasoning. She will need to justify why what everyone considered coherent is in fact built on a contradiction that no one else noticed. So she closes her mouth. She silently notes the observation. And she leaves the meeting with the strange feeling of watching a movie in slow motion while everyone around her is moving at normal speed. It's not arrogance, it's not superiority. It's a disconnect. This happens more often than she can count. In casual conversations, when someone makes a statement that seems simple but falls apart under the slightest logical examination. In collective decisions, when the majority chooses the most comfortable path, ignoring the inconsistency that is right there in plain sight. In widely accepted social narratives that everyone repeats without question, as if repetition makes them true, and every time this happens, the same question returns. Why am I the only one seeing this? It's not that she wants to see it. It's not that she has chosen to develop this perception. It's just that she can't turn it off. It's like having a magnifying glass installed in her eyes, which magnifies contradictions, inconsistencies, patterns hidden beneath the surface of the obvious. And the more she sees, the lonelier she becomes. Because seeing what others don't see is not a superpower. It's a displacement. It's living one step ahead or one step to the side of where everyone else is. It's realizing that for most people, what you consider fundamental simply does not exist in their field of vision. And then comes the weight. Not the weight of being misunderstood. That would be simple. The real weight is something else. It's the feeling that maybe you're seeing too much. That maybe this keen perception isn't a gift but a burden that no one taught you how to carry. Because deep down, social life works on consensus. And consensus depends on most people seeing more or less the same thing. When you see beyond that, or beneath it, or to the side of it, you break the invisible pact that keeps things running. And breaking that pact has a cost. There is a type of mind that works like this. Not because it chose to, not because it studied more, not because it made an effort to think differently, but simply because it thinks. And in thinking, it perceives what is hidden. It sees structures that others ignore. It recognizes patterns before they become evident. Schopenhauer called this disinterested perception, a way of looking at the world that is not driven by personal will, ambition, or desire for approval. It is a naked gaze, a gaze that sees things as they are, not as we would like them to be. And this gaze, when it takes hold, changes everything. It changes the way you listen to conversations. It changes the way you read the news. It changes the way you observe collective decisions. Because you don't just see what is being said. You see what is being hidden, what is being assumed without question, what is being repeated because it is easier to repeat than to think. And that inevitably puts you in a different place. Not above, not below, just displaced. Like someone watching a play while everyone else is on stage, living the scene as if it were real. But here's the paradox. This perception that separates you from others is the same one that allows you to understand things they don't understand. It's the same one that makes you see connections they don't see. It's the same one that gives you clarity about what's happening while everyone else is just reacting. So what is it? A gift? A curse? The answer, as is almost always the case, is not simple, because it depends on what you do with it. It depends on how you inhabit that difference. It depends on whether you turn lucidity into bitterness or into something that is still worth sustaining. And that is the question that runs through everything that follows. Because genius, or keen perception, or excessive lucidity, or whatever name you want to give it, is not just about seeing more. It's about what that seeing more does to you, how it isolates you, how it challenges you, how it puts you in front of choices that no one else has to make, and how in the end it forces you to decide, Are you going to use this perception to distance yourself from the world, or to understand it in a way that no one else can? So what exactly defines this difference? What separates someone who just thinks well from someone who thinks in a fundamentally different way? The answer is not intelligence. It is not IQ. It is not the amount of information accumulated or the speed of processing. It is something more subtle, something that has to do with the quality of attention, with the kind of questions you ask when faced with things, with what you can see when everyone else is looking in the same place. Schopenhauer called this the pure subject of knowledge, a rare state of mind in which a person temporarily forgets their own desires, ambitions, and immediate needs and simply observes without a filter, without an agenda, without wanting reality to be one way or another. It is a gaze stripped of will. And that is what differentiates genius from talent, because talent executes well what is already mapped out. Talent solves problems within known structures. Talent impresses because it does with excellence what others have already imagined to be possible. But genius sees what has not yet been seen. It perceives what has not yet been named. It identifies patterns where others see only noise. There is a quote attributed to Schopenhauer that captures this perfectly. Talent hits targets that others cannot hit. Genius hits targets that others cannot even see. The target is not there for most people. It simply does not exist in the field of possibilities. Not because they are incapable of hitting it, but because they cannot even conceive of it as a target. It's as if most people live in a two-dimensional world, solving two-dimensional problems with two-dimensional tools. And then suddenly someone notices the third dimension. Not because they studied more, not because they tried harder, but because for some reason their perception simply operates on a different frequency. And when that happens, everything changes. You start to see connections that no one else sees. You begin to realize that what everyone treats as established truth is in fact just convention repeated until it seems real. You begin to notice that the questions everyone asks already presuppose answers, and that the truly important answers are hidden in the questions no one is asking. This is not superiority. It is a structural difference. It's like having perfect pitch in music. You didn't choose to have it, you just have it. And because you have it, you notice dissonances that others don't. You notice harmonies that others don't hear. You notice silences that, to you, are deafening. Schopenhauer insisted that genius is not a constant performance. It is not something you can turn on and off at will. It is a state of consciousness that sets in, usually without warning. A moment when perception is freed from the ego, when you stop trying to use the world for your own ends and simply see. And in that pure seeing, universal essences are revealed. Not isolated facts, not practical information, but the deep structure of things, what they are, beneath what they appear to be. That is why genius is more closely linked to art and philosophy than to technique. Because technique deals with the useful, with the measurable, with what can be reproduced. But genius deals with the invisible, with what has not yet been named, with what can only be intuited, not demonstrated. Joseph Joubert said something revealing about this. Genius is the ability to see the invisible, to manipulate the intangible, to paint the formless. And that inevitably creates a problem. Because the world operates on visible structures, on measurable objectives, in results that can be evaluated, compared, ranked. And when you operate with the invisible, with the intangible, with what does not yet have form, the world simply does not know what to do with you. Not because you are better, not because you are worse, but because you are playing a different game. And different games have no criteria for comparison. It's like trying to explain color to someone who was born blind. It's not that the person is incapable of understanding complex concepts. It's that the experience you are trying to communicate simply doesn't exist in their perceptual universe, and that creates discomfort on both sides. For those who see differently, there is the frustration of not being able to convey what seems obvious. For those who don't see, there is the irritation of feeling that someone is complicating what should be simple. But here is the crucial point that Schopenhauer made a point of emphasizing. Genuine genius does not seek external validation. Not because it is arrogant, but because external validation simply means nothing when you are seeing something that has not yet been socially recognized as valid. Goethe said, "The first and last thing required of genius is love of truth. Love of truth, not love of recognition, not love of approval, love of truth in itself, regardless of who else sees it or fails to see it. And that requires a brutal renunciation. Renunciation of the need to belong. Renunciation of the need to be understood immediately. Renunciation of the need for your perceptions to be validated by collective consensus. Because collective consensus, by definition, is always behind the times. It is always validating what has already been proven. It is always recognizing what has already become safe to recognize. And genius, by definition, is on the frontier. It is where there is still no consensus. It is where there is still no certainty. It is where most people still cannot see. That is why so many historical geniuses were ignored, ridiculed, or even persecuted in their lifetime. Not because they were erratic, not because they were incompetent, but because they were seeing something that the world around them was not yet ready to see. Van Gogh sold one painting in his lifetime. One. And he died poor alone, considered a failure. Today his works are worth millions. Not because the works have changed, but because the world has finally reached the perception that he already had. Kafka asked for his manuscripts to be burned after his death. He felt that no one understood them. He felt he was writing for no one. Today he is considered one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. Tesla died without recognition. His ideas were considered absurd, impossible. Decades later, they became the basis of modern electricity. The pattern repeats itself. And it repeats itself because keen perception is structurally ahead of social recognition. And being ahead means being alone. It means seeing what cannot yet be validated. It means carrying a clarity that no one else shares. And that leads us to an inevitable question. If genius is so lonely, if keen perception separates you from social validation, if seeing more almost always means belonging less, why would anyone want that? Why would anyone cultivate this form of perception? The answer is simple but brutal. You don't choose it. It's not a decision. It's a way of being. It's how your mind is calibrated. And once calibrated that way, there's no going back. You can't unlearn what you've already seen. You can't pretend that contradictions don't exist. You can't force your perception to align with the consensus just to feel less alone. Because the truth once seen doesn't disappear. It remains. And by remaining, it redefines everything. It redefines your conversations. It redefines your choices. It even redefines silence. Because now you know why you are silent. And that is exactly what turns keen perception into a burden. Not because you see bad things, but because you can't stop seeing. And the more you see, the further you are from those who don't see. The more out of place, the more strange, the more isolated. And this isolation, as we will see, is not accidental. It is not a side effect. It is a structural consequence. It is the price of inhabiting a cognitive frequency that most people simply do not tune into. So the question remains, why is this difference in perception always accompanied by loneliness? Why do lucidity and isolation seem inseparable? And what does this reveal about the nature of social life, which works so well when everyone thinks alike, but disintegrates when someone thinks too differently? The answer lies in something that Schopenhauer perceived with uncomfortable clarity. The richer someone's inner world is, the less they need the outside world. And this is not abstract philosophy. It is a structural diagnosis. Think of it this way. Most people seek external validation because they don't have enough internal reference points. They seek approval because they don't have their own consolidated criteria. They seek belonging because they haven't built an internal meaning that they can sustain on their own. It's not weakness. It's just how the human psyche works when it hasn't developed internal density. It needs the social mirror to know if it's doing well. It needs consensus to know if it's right. It needs company to feel that it exists. But when someone develops sufficient internal density, when they build a rich, complex, self-sufficient mental universe, the need for external validation decreases dramatically. And with it, the need for constant social interaction also decreases. Schopenhauer was blunt. The more a man has in himself, the less he needs others. And he went even further. A high degree of intellect tends to make a man unsociable. Unsociable. Not because he despises people, but because he simply doesn't need them in the same way that most people do. Because he finds in his own thoughts a more interesting, more stimulating, more consistent companionship than most social interactions offer. And here's the cruel paradox. What frees you internally is exactly what imprisons you socially, because society works on reciprocity. I need you, you need me. I validate you, you validate me. I show up for your moments, you show up for mine. It's an implicit dance of mutual dependencies that keeps the social fabric cohesive. But when someone doesn't need this dance in the same way, when someone finds sufficiency in themselves, reciprocity breaks down. And with it, social connection dissolves. Not because you rejected people, but because you stopped feeding the system of dependencies they expect you to feed. And that marks you as strange, as distant, as someone who is always in their own world, as someone who doesn't open up, as someone who doesn't make an effort to belong. But the truth is different. You are not rejecting connection. You are operating on a different frequency of connection. A frequency that does not depend on constant presence, reciprocal validation, or repeated social rituals to keep the bond alive. You connect with ideas, with perceptions, with truths that remain true regardless of how many people agree with them. And this form of connection, although profound, is lonely. Because ideas don't hug you. Perceptions don't ask you how your day was. Truths don't show up on your birthday. There is another aspect of this that Schopenhauer identified with surgical precision. Disinterested perception creates absence of mind. What does that mean? It means that when you enter that state of pure observation, when you are genuinely seeing something, trying to understand its deep structure, you forget everything else. You forget commitments. You forget social conventions. You even forget to eat. You become absorbed. And in that absorption, you become, for all practical purposes, absent. Physically present, but mentally elsewhere. And the people around you notice this. They notice that you are there, but you are not there. And that bothers them. Because to them, you are being rude. You are being disinterested. You are showing that what they have to say is not important enough to hold your attention. But in fact, you are not being rude. You are being absorbed by something that for you is infinitely more fascinating than the superficial conversation that is taking place. Not because you think they are inferior, but because your mind simply cannot be satisfied with superficialities when there are depths to be explored. Schopenhauer described this as the price of genius. Genius dwells in the consideration of life itself, and in doing so it often forgets to consider its own path in life. It's like the painter so absorbed in color, light, and composition that he forgets to eat, that he forgets to sleep, that he even forgets to care whether anyone will buy the painting or not. It's not negligence, it's total absorption. It's the mind operating at maximum capacity, exploring territories that most people don't even know exist. But to outsiders, this looks like disconnection. It looks like coldness. It looks like you don't care. And in a sense, they're right. You really don't care the way they expect you to care, because your attention is elsewhere. It's on something that to you is infinitely more real than the social performances everyone else is performing. Emerson summed it up in one devastating line. To be great is to be misunderstood. Misunderstood. Not because you're complicated, but because you're operating on premises that others don't share. You're seeing things they don't see. You're asking questions they don't ask. And when you try to explain, when you try to translate what you're seeing, language fails. Because language is built to communicate shared experiences. And what you're trying to communicate isn't shared. Not yet. So you shut up. Or you simplify so much that the truth is lost. Or you speak, you are misunderstood, and you confirm the impression that you are strange, eccentric, disconnected. And little by little, you realize something brutal. It's easier to be alone. Not because you hate people, not because you think you're superior, but because the energy required to translate your perception into a vocabulary that others understand is greater than the reward you receive for doing so. So you stop trying, you stop explaining, you stop justifying why you see what you see. And in that silence, isolation takes hold. Schopenhauer was brutal in describing this process. Intellectual superiority is the most hated thing in the world, especially by mediocrities in the same field. Not because people are bad, but because keen perception involuntarily exposes the limitations of common perception. And no one likes to have their limitations exposed. No one likes to feel that they are seeing less than they could be seeing. So the natural reaction is to disqualify those who see more, to call them pretentious, complicated, someone who thinks too much, as if thinking too much were a defect, as if clarity were a problem. And so keen perception becomes social isolation, not because you chose to isolate yourself, but because the structure of social life automatically rejects those who think outside the consensus. History is full of examples of this. Van Gogh, isolated, considered crazy, ignored. Kafka, anguished, without readers, asking for his works to be destroyed. Tesla, brilliant, alone, dying poor while his ideas were stolen by those who knew how to sell, but not how to see. The pattern repeats itself because it is structural. It is not coincidence. It is not bad luck. It is the inevitable consequence of being ahead of the perceptual curve. And that brings us face to face with a difficult truth. Lucidity and belonging are, to a large extent, incompatible. Not always, not absolutely, but often enough that most people who develop keen perception face this dilemma, continue to see and accept the loneliness that comes with it, or unlearn what they have seen and return to the comfort of consensus. But here's the problem. You can't unlearn. Not really. Once you've seen, you've seen. And pretending you haven't seen doesn't erase the vision. It just adds falsehood to isolation. So you're stuck, seeing too much to belong, but unable to stop seeing. And that's exactly where an even more subtle danger arises. A danger that doesn't come from outside but from within. A danger that has to do not with what others do with your perception, but with what you yourself do with it. Because sharp perception, when it has nowhere to go, when it finds no expression, when it finds no purpose, can turn against itself. It can become endless rumination. It can become paralysis. It can become a mental prison from which there is no escape. And that is what we are going to explore now. The silent danger that lies within lucidity itself. There is a danger that no one warns you about. A danger that lies exactly where you least expect it, within your own search for understanding. Because when you have a mind that naturally thinks in layers, that questions structures, that is not satisfied with superficial answers, there is a silent temptation. A temptation to keep consuming, to keep reading, to keep absorbing ideas, perspectives, theories, explanations. And the logic seems flawless. The more you understand, the clearer the world becomes. The more you learn, the better equipped you are to think for yourself. But Schopenhauer noticed something disturbing in this process. Something that completely contradicts the modern narrative that more information is always better. He said reading is only a substitute for thinking. And he went further. Many educated men have read themselves into stupidity. They read themselves into stupidity, not because of a lack of intelligence, not because of an inability to understand, but because they filled their minds with so many other people's ideas that there was no room left for their own. It's like filling a notebook with brilliant quotes from other people until there's not a single blank page left for you to write on. The notebook is full, but there's nothing of yours in there. Just echoes, just repetitions, only second-hand thoughts. Montaigne saw this centuries earlier. He observed with cruel irony how pedants, supposedly educated men, worked obsessively to fill their memory while leaving their conscience and understanding completely empty. They knew how to quote Plato. They knew how to recite Aristotle. They knew how to memorize entire passages from classical texts. But they didn't know how to think. They did not know how to look at the life before them and extract meaning for themselves. They did not know how to do the only thing that really matters, transform information into understanding. Schopenhauer was even more precise in diagnosing the mechanism. The more we read, the more the mind becomes like a wax tablet written on many times with no space for new impressions. The image is brutal. Your mind, which should be a receptive surface for original thoughts, becomes a saturated surface, overwritten so many times with other people's ideas that there is no more room to write anything new, nothing of your own. And then comes the deadly paradox. You consume content to become smarter, but the act of consuming without pause is stunting the very intelligence you are trying to develop. Because intelligence is not accumulation. Intelligence is digestion. It is taking something external and transforming it into internal insight. It is allowing ideas to ferment, mix, and combine in unexpected ways until something new emerges. But that takes time. It requires silence. It requires empty space. And empty space is exactly what the modern mind lacks. Before, the danger was reading too much. Today, the danger has multiplied. It's not just books, it's podcasts, it's articles, it's Twitter threads, it's YouTube videos, it's newsletters, it's audiobooks, it's online courses, it's book summaries, it's TED Talks, it's documentaries, it's LinkedIn posts, it's recorded conversations of intelligent people talking about important things. And all of this is available all the time, anytime, anywhere. All it takes is a few taps on the screen. So the mind never rests. It never stops. It is never idle enough for something original to emerge from the silence. Schopenhauer got straight to the point. Reading to escape one's own thoughts is a sin against the Holy Spirit. A sin against the Holy Spirit. This is not rhetorical exaggeration. It is an accurate diagnosis. Because when you use reading, or any form of intellectual consumption, as an escape from yourself, as a way of not facing the emptiness of your own mind, you're literally killing the possibility of original thought. You're filling the silence with noise. You are replacing reflection with absorption. You are exchanging the difficult task of thinking for the comfortable illusion of learning. And the illusion is convincing, because you are in fact absorbing information. You are in fact expanding your conceptual vocabulary. You are in fact learning more perspectives. But learning more perspectives does not mean having your own perspective. And having conceptual vocabulary does not mean having your own thoughts. And absorbing information does not mean generating understanding. Confucius captured the balance perfectly. Studying without thinking is useless. Thinking without studying is dangerous. Both are necessary, but the order matters. And what is lacking today is not study. It is thought. It is not input. It is processing. It is not absorption. It is digestion. Goethe understood this. He said that learning needs to be filtered through one's own inner light. That it is not enough to absorb like a sponge. You have to squeeze the sponge. Transform what you have absorbed into something personal. Something that passes through the filter of your experience, your doubt, your restlessness. Otherwise, you become just an echo, a repository of brilliant ideas that are not your own, a walking catalogue of impressive quotes that you have not lived. And here's the crucial point for those with naturally questioning minds. You are at even greater risk, because questioning minds are attracted to complexity. They are attracted to depth. They are attracted to dense, rich, sophisticated systems of thought. And there is so much of that available today that you could spend a lifetime consuming it and never get to the bottom of it. You can read all the philosophers. You can study all the schools of thought. You can explore all the contemplative traditions. You can absorb all the scientific, psychological, sociological perspectives. And in the end, you will have a gigantic mental library but no thoughts of your own worth saying, because you never stopped. You never stayed silent long enough for something original to sprout. You never resisted the temptation to fill the void with another book, another podcast, another article. Pascal said something that still bites deep. All of humanity's problems arise from man's inability to sit alone in silence in a room. Silence, solitude, boredom, emptiness. These are not enemies of thought. They are its conditions of possibility. They are the fertile ground where something original can be born. But modern culture has trained us to fear exactly that. To fear emptiness, to fear boredom, to fear the inner silence that is not being filled by anything. So at any sign of boredom, we pick up our cell phones. At any moment of waiting, we put something in our ears. At any moment of mental silence, we look for something to consume. And so, without realizing it, we commit the sin that Schopenhauer warned us about. We drown our own thoughts in a sea of other people's thoughts. We exchange the difficulty of thinking for the ease of absorbing. And worse, we do this thinking that we are becoming more intelligent, more cultured, more profound. But the truth is the opposite. We are becoming more saturated, more overwhelmed, more dependent on external references to form any opinion. Because we have not developed the muscle of independent thinking. We have only developed the habit of intellectual consumption. And consumption, however sophisticated it may be, never replaces creation. Schopenhauer had a simple rule. One should only read when one's own thoughts have come to a standstill at the source. In other words, read when you really need external stimulation to reactivate your thinking. Don't read to avoid thinking. Don't read to fill a void. Don't read as anesthesia against your own mind. Read as a catalyst. Read as provocation. Read as an interlocutor that challenges your ideas, not as a substitute for them. And between one reading and another, between one podcast and another, between one video and another, leave space, leave silence, leave boredom. Let your mind wander aimlessly until something unexpected arises. Because genuine insight never comes from accumulation. It comes from connection. It comes from noticing something that no one told you, but that was there all along, waiting for you to stop long enough to notice. And that only happens in emptiness. In silence, in the space between one thought and another that you haven't filled with more information. The genius that Schopenhauer described is not a product of how much you know. It is a product of how you see. And you don't learn to see by consuming more. You learn to see by looking more, by observing more, by allowing the reality before you to be more interesting than any prefabricated explanation of it. And that today is almost impossible, because we have been trained to always seek explanation before observing. To always seek interpretation before experiencing, to always seek theory before perception. We've reversed the order, and in reversing it, we've lost what really matters, the ability to see for ourselves, to think for ourselves, to reach conclusions that weren't handed to us ready-made by someone else. And here's the final irony. The desire to understand more can make you less able to understand. Not because knowledge is bad, but because knowledge without digestion is just noise, and noise suffocates clarity. And without clarity, the keen perception you could develop never happens, because it is always being interrupted by more input, more information, more content. And so paradoxically, the quest for clarity becomes the very obstacle to clarity. But that's not the only risk. There is another. One that has to do not with how much you consume, but with what you do with the clarity you manage to develop. One that has to do with the temptation to turn sharp perception into moral superiority. And that, perhaps, is the most subtle danger of all. There is a dangerous moment in the journey of any mind that thinks differently. A moment when lucidity begins to be confused with superiority, when sharp perception silently turns into constant judgment. And the worst part is that it happens so gradually, so subtly, that you don't even notice when you cross the line. Because in the beginning, all you feel is validation. Validation of perceiving patterns that others don't perceive. Validation of anticipating consequences that others don't anticipate. Validation of seeing contradictions that go completely unnoticed by most. And this validation is real. You really are seeing something that others are not seeing. The keen perception exists. The cognitive difference is structural, not imaginary. But there is a point where validation of perception becomes something more dangerous. It becomes validation of identity. It becomes the feeling that because you see more, you are more. Because you perceive better, you are better. And that's where the slippery slope begins. Schopenhauer warned about this with a brutality that is unsettling. Intellectual superiority is the most hated thing in the world, especially by those who work in the same field and do not have the same level. But what he didn't say, and perhaps didn't need to, is that intellectual superiority can also be the most toxic thing for those who possess it, not because of the reaction of others, but because of the transformation it can cause in those who have it. Because when you realize you see more, there is an almost irresistible temptation to start positioning yourself above others, to start looking at people not as different, but as limited, not as operating on a different frequency, but as operating on a lower frequency. And that changes everything. It changes the way you listen, because now you don't listen to understand. You listen to identify the flaw, to point out the mistake, to confirm that the person didn't see what you already saw. It changes the way you speak, because now you don't speak to share, you speak to demonstrate, to prove that you understand more, to establish cognitive hierarchy. It even changes the way you remain silent, because now silence is no longer reflection, it is silent judgment. It is the feeling that you could correct everything that is being said, but you choose not to because it would be a waste of time. And in this process, something fundamental is lost: compassion. Not the sentimental, emotional, superficial compassion, but the structural compassion that Schopenhauer himself identified as the basis of morality. The ability to recognize that the other, even if limited, is doing the best they can with the cognitive tools they have. Because here's the brutal truth: you didn't choose to see more. You did not deserve this keen perception. You did not try harder. Your mind is simply calibrated that way. And mental calibration is not a moral achievement. It is a biological and circumstantial accident. So, if you did not choose to have keen perception, why should someone who does not have it be judged for that? Why should the other person's perceptual limitation make you feel superior if your own perception is not your merit? But the mind doesn't reason that way when it's immersed in its own brilliance. The mind forgets that lucidity is not a virtue, that keen perception is not an ethical achievement, that seeing more does not make you morally better. It just makes you different. And difference is not hierarchy, it's just difference. Nietzsche understood this in a way that Schopenhauer did not fully explore. He spoke of the free spirit, one who thinks independently, who questions structures, who does not allow himself to be tamed by social consensus. But Nietzsche's free spirit does not despise the herd. He does not look down on the majority with arrogance. He simply does not allow the majority to tame him. It preserves its cognitive autonomy without needing to turn that into superiority. It's a subtle but essential distinction. You can think differently without judging those who think commonly. You can see more without despising those who see less. You can have lucidity without turning it into a moral stance. But this requires something very difficult. It requires you to give up the psychological comfort that comes from feeling superior. Because feeling superior is tempting. It is comforting. It is a way to compensate for the isolation that comes with keen perception. If you do not belong socially, at least you can belong to an imaginary hierarchy where you are at the cognitive top. And so without realizing it, you build a prison made of disdain, of impatience, of condescension, of silences laden with judgment. And in that prison, loneliness deepens. But now it comes with an additional ingredient: bitterness. Because when you constantly judge, when you are always pointing out the mistakes of others, when you consistently place yourself above them, you are not just isolated. You are isolated and resentful, isolated and angry, isolated and increasingly convinced that the world is made up of mediocrities who do not deserve your time. And then, ironically, you confirm your own prophecy. Because by treating others as limited, you ensure that they will never show you their own depths. By positioning yourself as superior, you ensure that no one will want to share their best thoughts with you. And so you are trapped in a vicious cycle. You judge because you feel isolated, and you isolate yourself more and more because you judge. Schopenhauer had a phrase that, read superficially, seems to validate superiority. Genius is like a lightning bolt that breaks through the darkness. But the image, when examined carefully, is not one of hierarchy. It is one of function. Lightning is not superior to darkness. It simply illuminates. And illuminating is a service, not a conquest. That is why he insisted that genuine genius renounces the validation of contemporaries. Not because it despises contemporaries, but because it understands that immediate validation is not a criterion of truth, that social recognition does not measure cognitive value, that applause from the masses does not determine the depth of insight. And this renunciation is not arrogance. It is radical humility. It is understanding that you may be seeing something real, something important, something true, and yet be completely alone in that perception. And that does not make you superior. It makes you responsible. Responsible for not distorting what you see. Responsible for not turning lucidity into a weapon. Responsible for not using keen perception as a justification for intellectual cruelty. Because intellectual cruelty is real, and it is destructive. It's when you use your clarity to humiliate. When you use your perception to publicly expose the limitations of others. When you use your sharp thinking as an instrument of symbolic domination. And Schopenhauer was very clear about this. When art or intellect are mixed with base objectives, money, flattery, power, it is detestable. Detestable, not just wrong, detestable, because it perverts what should be a gift into an instrument of ego. It turns clarity into a weapon. It converts perception into performance. And performance is exactly the opposite of what sharp perception should be. Because genuine perception is disinterested, remember? It's seeing things as they are, not as they suit you. It's understanding without an agenda. It is clarity without manipulation. But when you perform your intelligence, when you use your lucidity to impress, to dominate, to establish superiority, you betray the very nature of keen perception. And you become, ironically, exactly what you despised. Someone who uses cognitive tools for personal gain. Someone who distorts truth for their own benefit. Someone who turns what should be clarity into a self-promotion strategy. Cicero said something that should be tattooed on the mind of anyone with keen perception. The higher we are, the more humbly we must walk. The higher, the more humbly. Not because you need to pretend you don't see what you see, but because you need to understand that seeing more is not a personal achievement. It is a collective responsibility. It is being the bearer of something that can enlighten, but can also hurt, and it is up to you to choose what to do with it. And that choice defines everything. It defines whether your lucidity will become service or tyranny. It defines whether your keen perception will build bridges or walls. It defines whether you will use your clarity to elevate or to crush. And here is the crucial moment of this video. The moment when everything we have talked about so far comes together. Because if you have come this far, if these words have resonated with you, if you have recognized in yourself this form of perception that separates and isolates you, then you are faced with a choice. You can use this as a justification for arrogance. You can turn your cognitive displacement into moral superiority. You can inhabit your lucidity as if it were an achievement, not an accident. Or you can do the opposite. You can recognize that keen perception is both a burden and a gift. You can understand that seeing more does not make you superior, but responsible. You can accept that your clarity, if not tempered with compassion, becomes just another form of blindness. And if you're on that second path, if you want to inhabit your keen perception without losing your humanity in the process, then this channel is for you. Because here, we explore exactly that. How to think deeply without becoming cynical. How to perceive more without constantly judging. How to have lucidity without losing compassion. How to live with keen perception in a way that enlightens, not burns. If this makes sense to you, subscribe. Because the next videos will delve even deeper into these questions. They will explore what philosophy, from Schopenhauer to Kierkegaard, from Nietzsche to Simone Weil, has to say about how to inhabit a mind that thinks differently without losing itself in its own difference. But there is something else, something that still needs to be said. Because even when you avoid arrogance, even when you preserve compassion, there is still a risk that lies not in the judgment of others, but in the way you deal with yourself. And that risk has to do with what happens when the mind that thinks too much turns completely inward. There is a kind of loneliness that is even worse than social isolation. It is the loneliness that happens when you are trapped inside your own mind. Not for a few minutes, not for a few hours, but chronically. So that external reality, people, events, experiences, begins to seem less real than the internal monologue that never stops. Dostoevsky knew this prison intimately. He wrote about it in Notes from Underground with brutal precision. The protagonist, a man of excessive conscience, describes how overthinking completely paralyzed him. He says, "I suffer from heightened consciousness. It is a disease, an illness, not a virtue, not a gift, an illness. Because there is a point where lucidity ceases to enlighten and begins to consume, where keen perception ceases to reveal and begins to imprison, where thought ceases to be a tool and becomes a cage." Kierkegaard called this the anguish of conscience, the anguish of those who see too much and act too little, of those who perceive all the possibilities, all the consequences, all the contradictions, and are paralyzed precisely because of that. Because when you see all sides of an issue, how do you choose one? When you perceive all the possible flaws in a path, how do you walk it? When you anticipate all the ways something can go wrong, how do you act? The simple answer is you don't act. You stand still, analyzing, ruminating, thinking about thinking. And in the process, life passes you by. Not theoretically, literally. Opportunities close, relationships wear thin, time slips away, and you remain trapped inside your own head analyzing why you can't get out of it. Thoreau said something that captures this perfectly. It is easier to sail 1,000 miles on the ocean than to explore the private sea of one's own being. Easier, not more important. Easier, because sailing oceans requires only physical courage, but exploring the inner ocean, that requires you to face something much worse than storms. It requires you to face yourself, your fears, your contradictions, your destructive patterns that you see clearly but can't change. And for someone with keen perception, this is torture, because you don't have the mercy of unconsciousness. You can't pretend you don't know. You can't fool yourself with comforting narratives. You see? And seeing, you can't escape. So you get stuck in this loop. You see the problem, analyze the problem, understand the problem, but you don't solve the problem, because solving it would require action, and action would require temporarily giving up analysis. And giving up analysis seems irresponsible when you have a mind that is always analyzing. It's a cruel paradox. The very clarity that should set you free becomes the very obstacle to freedom. Kierkegaard diagnosed this as the anguish of infinite possibility. When you have a mind sophisticated enough to imagine infinite possibilities, you become paralyzed by your own imagination. Each choice excludes all others. Each action closes doors. And when you see too clearly how many doors each choice closes, choosing becomes unbearable. So you procrastinate. You analyze some more. You wait until you are absolutely certain. But absolute certainty never comes, because the more you think, the more variables you notice, more nuances, more complications. And so, the lucidity that should guide you becomes the labyrinth from which you cannot escape. There is a crucial difference between contemplation and rumination. Contemplation is productive observation. It's when you look at something, an idea, a situation, a dilemma, and extract understanding. And having extracted understanding, you act accordingly. Rumination is different. Rumination is when you think about the same thing over and over again without getting anywhere. It's circular thinking. It's analysis that never turns into a decision. It's clarity that never turns into action. And for minds that naturally think deeply, the line between contemplation and rumination is dangerously thin, because you can spend hours, days, weeks thinking about something, thinking you're contemplating, when in fact you're just ruminating, thinking you're seeking clarity, when in fact you're running away from a decision, thinking you're being profound, when in fact you're just being cowardly. Schopenhauer realized this when he said, "Genius dwells in the consideration of life itself, and often forgets to consider its own path in life. It forgets to consider its own path, not because they are incapable, but because it is easier to think about life in the abstract than to live their concrete life. It is easier to philosophize about meaning than to construct meaning. It is easier to analyze the experiences of others than to have experiences of their own." And so paradoxically, the person who could have deeper insights into life ends up living less. They end up being a spectator of their own existence. They end up replacing experience with analysis of experience. It's like spending your life studying swimming but never getting in the water. Like reading all the books on love but never loving. Like deeply understanding the nature of courage but never being courageous. And the more you do this, the more the prison closes in. Because now you're not just socially isolated. You're isolated from yourself. Separated from your own life by a layer of analysis that never stops. And worse, you justify it as depth, as intellectual seriousness, as a responsibility to think carefully before acting. But deep down, you know you're running away. You know you're using thought as anesthesia against life. You know you're hiding in your own mind because the reality outside demands something you're not ready to give. Presence, commitment, risk. There is a point where keen perception ceases to be perception and becomes obsession. It ceases to be clarity and becomes paralysis. It ceases to be lucidity and becomes just another form of blindness. Blindness to the life that is happening while you are lost in your own thoughts. And when you reach that point, the genius that Schopenhauer described becomes a pure burden. No reward, just weight, just imprisonment, just the devastating feeling that you can see everything, understand everything, but can't live anything. So what's left? When social isolation combines with mental imprisonment, when lucidity turns into paralysis, when keen perception becomes just another form of suffering, what's left? There is one choice left. The most difficult choice of all. The choice to inhabit your keen perception without losing yourself in it. To have lucidity without letting it paralyze you. To think deeply without forgetting to live concretely. And this choice is not theoretical. It is not philosophical. It is practical. It is daily. It is the decision repeated 1,000 times not to let thought replace life. So we come to the point where everything meets, where all the risks we have mapped out, isolation, mental saturation, arrogance, paralysis, converge in a single question. If you have keen perception, what should you do with it? And note, it is not what you can do, it is what you should do, because there is an ethical dimension here that cannot be ignored. Schopenhauer, despite all his pessimism about life, was crystal clear about one thing. Morality is born of compassion, of the ability to recognize the suffering of others as real, as worthy of attention, as something that moves you beyond your own interests. And if you have keen perception, if you see patterns that others don't see, if you anticipate consequences that others don't anticipate, if you understand structures that remain invisible to most, then you carry something, not a privilege, a responsibility. Because perception is not neutral. Perception has weight, it has effect. It can enlighten or it can blind. It can liberate or it can imprison. It can build or it can destroy. And it's up to you to choose how you use it. Einstein said something that should echo in any mind that thinks differently. Don't try to become a successful person. Try to become a person of value. A person of value, not a person of prominence, not a person of recognition, a person of value. And value here is not market value. It is not status value. It is moral value. It is the question. What are you doing with your clarity? Are you using it to serve or to dominate? Are you using it to enlighten or to humiliate? Are you using it to build bridges or to establish hierarchies? Cicero was even more direct. The higher we are, the more humbly we must walk. More humbly. Not because you need to pretend you don't know. Not because you need to diminish yourself. But because you need to understand that every keen perception comes with a shadow. The shadow of temptation. The temptation to use clarity as a weapon. To turn insight into superiority. To convert understanding into control. And resisting this temptation is the first ethical responsibility of those who think differently. Because the world already has enough arrogance. There are already people using intelligence to manipulate. There are already people using perception to exploit. There are already people turning clarity into a strategy for domination. And if you have genuine perception, if you really see more, then you have a responsibility not to add more of that to the world. You have a responsibility to do the opposite, to use your clarity with care, with humility, with the awareness that seeing more does not make you morally superior, only morally responsible. Simone Weil wrote something devastating about this. She said that true attention, genuine, disinterested, focused attention is the rarest form of generosity. The rarest form of generosity. Because it's easy to give money. It's easy to give time. It's even easy to give advice. But to give real attention, attention that isn't trying to fix, isn't trying to impress, isn't trying to prove anything, attention that just sees the other person as they are, without an agenda, without judgment, without the need to redefine their experience on your own terms, that is extremely rare. And that is exactly what keen perception should allow. Not the ability to analyze the other person, but the ability to see the other person, really see them, with the same clarity that you apply to ideas, systems, patterns. But here's the problem. It's easier to analyze than to see. It's easier to diagnose than to accompany. It's easier to explain someone than to be present with someone. And when you have an analytical mind, the temptation is always to reduce. Reduce the person to patterns. Reduce the experience to categories. Reduce suffering to identifiable causes and applicable solutions. But human suffering is not a technical problem. It is not a puzzle to be solved. It is an experience to be recognized. And recognition requires presence, not analysis. Schopenhauer understood this when he emphasized compassion as the foundation of morality. Compassion is not pity. It is not condescension. It is recognition that the suffering of others is as real as your own, that the experience of others has its own density, that you don't need to understand completely in order to fully validate. And that is radical humility. It is renouncing the need to have all the answers. It is accepting that even with keen perception, you don't see everything. You don't know everything. You don't have the right to redefine someone else's reality on your own terms. There is a quote from Confucius that captures this perfectly. The superior man is modest in his speech, but exceeds in his actions. Modest in his speech, exceeds in his actions. Not the other way around. Not excessive speech and modesty in action, but the opposite. Few words, many deeds. Clarity translated into service, not performance. And service here is not heroic self-sacrifice. It's just doing the obvious, using what you see to improve what you can improve. No fanfare, no need for recognition, no turning it into a narrative of superiority. But this requires something brutal. It requires you to give up the psychological comfort of being recognized as brilliant, because recognition is addictive, especially for minds that think differently. especially for people who have spent their lives feeling out of place. When someone finally recognizes your brilliance, when someone finally validates your perception, the temptation is to cling to it, to make it your identity, to need it to feel valuable. But Schopenhauer was clear. Genuine genius renounces the validation of contemporaries, not because it despises contemporaries, but because it understands that immediate validation does not measure truth, that social recognition does not determine real value, that applause can be just noise that distracts from real work. And real work is not to impress, it is to enlighten. It is not to be recognized as intelligent. It is to make things understandable. It is not to establish superiority. It is to share clarity. And sharing clarity without arrogance is an art. It is a difficult balance, because you need to have enough confidence in what you see to sustain it, but enough humility not to impose it. You need to be firm in the truth without being rigid in form. You need to be clear in perception without being aggressive in communication. You need to enlighten without blinding, and that requires constant vigilance. Vigilance over your own intentions, over the motives that drive you, over whether you are sharing because you truly believe it will help, or whether you are sharing because you want to prove something about yourself, about your intelligence, about your superiority disguised as generosity, because it is very easy to confuse the two. It's very easy to think you're helping when in fact you're showing off. It's very easy to think you're enlightening when in fact you're dominating. And the difference is in the intention. It's in why you're saying what you're saying. It's in whether you're willing to be ignored, challenged, rejected, and still maintain clarity, or if your clarity depends on being validated in order to continue to exist. Because if it depends on validation, then it's not clarity, it's performance. And performance always betrays the truth eventually. There is another dimension to this responsibility that is even more difficult. It has to do with knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. Because not every insight needs to be shared, not every truth needs to be told, not every clarity needs to be imposed. Sometimes the most ethical thing you can do with your keen perception is to hold it back. Not because you are hiding the truth, but because you understand that the person in front of you is not ready to hear it. That forcing premature clarity can be more destructive than letting confusion run its natural course. And that requires a form of wisdom that goes beyond intelligence. It requires timing. It requires sensitivity. It requires understanding that truth without proper context can be just violence disguised as honesty. It requires you to accept that sometimes the smartest thing to do is to appear less smart. The clearest thing to do is to allow ambiguity. The truest thing to do is not to say everything you see, and that is brutal renunciation. Renunciation of the impulse to always correct, to always clarify, to always demonstrate that you saw what others did not see. But it is necessary renunciation, because ethical responsibility is not just about what you do with your perception. It's about what you choose not to do, about when you choose silence, about when you choose to allow others to reach their own conclusions, even if it takes time, even if it's imperfect, even if you could speed up the process. Because there is dignity in letting people think for themselves. There is a respect in not solving everything for them. There is compassion in allowing them to make mistakes that you have already identified, because those mistakes may be exactly what they need to learn. And holding back your insight when you could use it, that is real power. Not power over others, power over yourself. The power of not needing to prove anything. The power to let your clarity exist without needing to constantly validate it through the correction of others. But all of this ethical responsibility, all of this vigilance over intentions, all of this balance between speaking and remaining silent comes at a price we have not yet fully named. A price that has to do with what happens when you try to do everything right, try to be ethical, try to use your insight with humility and compassion, and still feel lost. Because ethical responsibility does not cure loneliness. It doesn't eliminate displacement. It doesn't erase the fact that you see things that others don't see. And that inevitably puts you in a different place, a place from which there is no return. So what's left when you've done everything right? When you've avoided arrogance, avoided paralysis, taken on ethical responsibility, and still carry the weight of perceiving more than you would like. So we come to the end. Not the end of a solution, but the end of a journey of recognition. Because everything we've explored so far, structural isolation, internal risks, the temptations of arrogance, the paralysis of excessive awareness, ethical responsibility, all of this converges on a truth that can no longer be avoided. If you have keen perception, you will carry this alone. Not always, not absolutely, but often enough that loneliness becomes a permanent part of the landscape of your life. And the question that remains is not how to eliminate this loneliness, because there is no way to eliminate it. The question is, how to inhabit this loneliness so that it does not destroy you. Schopenhauer had an image for this. He said that genius stands on the bare rock of truth. While most people live on the shifting sands of consensus, conventions, social narratives that change with the tide, those who think differently are planted elsewhere, on something more solid, more stable, but also more exposed, the bare rock of truth. It's not a comfortable metaphor. Rock is hard, it's cold, it's lonely. There's no vegetation there, there's no shelter, there's nothing but the solidity of the stone and the vastness of the sky. But that's where you can see the furthest. That's where the horizon expands. That's where perspectives impossible from other angles become visible. And that's the trade-off. You gain clarity, but you lose comfort. You gain vision, but you lose belonging. You gain truth, but you lose the comforting illusion that everyone is seeing the same thing. And there is no escaping this trade-off. There is no hidden third option. There is no secret path where you have both clarity and belonging, where you see more and still fit in perfectly. Because belonging depends on consensus, and consensus depends on most people seeing more or less the same thing. And if you see too differently, you break the consensus. And by breaking the consensus, you put yourself outside the circle of belonging, not by choice, not out of arrogance, but because of structure, because of a mental calibration you didn't ask for and can't turn off. So what's left? Acceptance remains, not resignation, not giving up, but a lucid acceptance that this is the condition. That keen perception comes with this cost, and that trying to avoid the cost is trying to avoid perception itself. Rilke wrote something about loneliness that cuts deep. Loneliness is necessary. Don't avoid it. Live in it. Live in it. Don't run away from it. Don't try to desperately fill it with superficial connections just so you don't feel the emptiness. Don't try to unlearn what you've seen just to return to the comfort of thinking like everyone else. Dwell in solitude. Recognize it as part of the journey, as territory that comes with the kind of mind you have. And in dwelling, you discover something strange, something that is only visible from within solitude itself. You discover that there is a difference between bitter loneliness and dignified loneliness. Bitter loneliness is when you feel isolated and resentful, when you look at others with envy or disdain, when you blame the world for not understanding you, when you turn your displacement into a victim identity or an attitude of superiority. Dignified loneliness is different. It is when you recognize isolation, feel its weight, but do not let it corrupt you. It is when you maintain compassion even without belonging. It is when you preserve integrity even without validation. It is when you continue to see clearly even though you know that few will see what you see. It is loneliness that needs no justification. It needs no audience. It needs no eventual recognition to be bearable. It is loneliness that simply is, and you inhabit it with the dignity of someone who knows they are seeing something real, something important, something true, regardless of how many people agree. And here's the final paradox. When you accept loneliness, when you stop fighting it, when you stop desperately trying to find external validation, loneliness becomes less burdensome, not because it disappears, but because you stop adding suffering to suffering. You stop adding resistance to what is already difficult. You stop turning structural isolation into existential drama. You simply recognize, I think differently. That sets me apart. And that's okay. Not in the sense that it's easy, not in the sense that it's preferable, but in the sense that it's real. It is what it is. And accepting what is releases energy that was previously trapped in resistance. Schopenhauer insisted that genuine genius looks centuries ahead, not because it despises the present, but because it understands that contemporary validation is not a criterion of truth, that you can be right and alone. You may be seeing something real and not be recognized. You may be contributing something valuable and die without knowing if anyone cared. And that doesn't invalidate what you saw. It doesn't make your perception any less true. It doesn't make your work any less important. It just means you won't know the immediate result. You won't reap the rewards in your lifetime. You won't have the comfort of validation while you live. And accepting that, really accepting it, not just intellectually but viscerally, is liberation. It's the liberation of stopping waiting, of stopping needing, of stopping depending on external recognition to sustain internal clarity. Because when you no longer need validation, you are free. Free to see what is really there. Free to say what needs to be said. Free to hold silence when silence is wiser. Free to make mistakes, correct them, learn, without needing to protect an image of infallibility. And that freedom to be honest, to be fallible, to be human while maintaining keen perception, is what transforms loneliness from a burden into dignity. Not because you chose to be lonely, but because you chose not to let loneliness corrupt you. You chose not to turn displacement into bitterness. You chose not to use sharp perception as a weapon against those who don't see what you see. You chose in the end to use your clarity in the only way that really matters, with integrity. And integrity here is not moral perfection. It is simply consistency between what you see and how you act, between what you understand and how you treat people, between the clarity you have and the compassion you maintain. It is living in such a way that when you look in the mirror, you recognize someone who has not betrayed their own perception, someone who has not used lucidity to dominate, someone who has not turned truth into performance, someone who simply saw, and seeing, did the best they could with what they saw, without guarantees, without assured recognition, without knowing if it made a difference, but with the quiet dignity of knowing that they tried, that they didn't give up, that they didn't corrupt their own clarity for comfort or belonging. And that, in the end, is what remains. Not a magic solution, not a cure for isolation, not the elimination of displacement, just the daily choice to inhabit your keen perception without getting lost in it, to have lucidity without letting it paralyze you, to see more without judging those who see less, to be alone without being bitter. And when you make that choice repeatedly, day after day, something changes. Not external reality, not the fact that you think differently, not the structure of isolation, but your relationship with all of it. Your ability to bear the weight without being crushed by it. Your ability to transform loneliness from imprisonment into freedom. Your ability to use keen perception not as a curse but as a responsibility worth carrying. Because in the end, keen perception is both a burden and a gift. And wisdom is not in choosing one or the other. It is in accepting both. It lies in carrying the burden with dignity and using the gift with compassion. And if you've come this far, if these words resonate with you, if you recognize in yourself this form of perception that separates you and makes you responsible at the same time, then you already know what needs to be done. There is no recipe. There is no perfect map. There is only the choice to continue seeing, to continue thinking, to continue perceiving, but to do so with integrity, with humility, with the awareness that lucidity does not make you superior, only different. And that difference, when inhabited with dignity, can be silent service to the world. What about you? Have you always felt that you think at a different frequency, that you perceive connections that others ignore? Leave a comment. When was the moment you realized that you saw the world in a different way? Watch the next videos on the channel, count on me, and follow the White Rabbit.